We're on. And that screen's not on. It's morning. What's it going to sleep for? So I was running a mite late this morning. Karen decided to step in a puddle of water on the floor in our hotel room. And then she tried to figure out where it was coming from. And that caused us to be a little late. We found out it was flowing out from underneath of a sink in our room. But anyway, that'll take care of itself while we're gone. Thankfully, it's not our house. So we're looking at the times of Daniel 11 and 12. When I started working on Daniel 11, there was a question that some people were throwing at me, and it was a good question, and I didn't have a good answer for it yet. Here was the question. If the appointed time is in Daniel 11, 29, and 30, and that is after the Crusades, so verse 29 would be sometime after the Crusades, like, 1200, 1300, somewhere in there. But verse 31 talks about when the papacy gets the force of arms, which would be 508. How could you be around 1300 in verse 29 and 30 and be back at 508 and 31? A good question, right? So my answer at the beginning was, well, if we knew what the appointed time was, it would probably answer it. But nobody knew what the appointed time was. And I had a hunch it had something to do with the 1290 and 1335. But I didn't know for sure. And so I went to Daniel 12 symposiums that were trying to discover what the 1290 and 1335 was. And they didn't seem to have a good answer. And everything that got said seemed a little strange. And, for a long time in my life, I'd kind of thought maybe the 1290 and 1335 were just a little too hard for me to understand. And because I thought they were too hard to understand, I never tried very hard. After going to some symposiums and really getting hit on the question of how can 508 be in verse 31 and 1300 about in 29 and 30, I decided to sit down and dig for the answer. It was in December of 2011. My book was already out. And we were catching some flack coming back, which we expected to have some flack right after it got published. And actually, there were 5 books written in opposition to what I had to say. You don't really know about those books because they all had major flaws and disappeared. So none of them stuck. But I wanted to know what's the truth of the sequencing of Daniel 11, 29, 30, and 31. And I figured I better understand what is the appointed time and what's the 1290 and 1335. And I sat down and asked the Lord to help me, and even if it turned my world upside down and I had to pull the book, I was willing. I just wanted to know the truth. And once I got that serious about it, within a day or two, the answer started coming. And here's what I found. We have 3 time periods mentioned in Daniel chapter 11. There is for a time, papacy would have power for a time. There's the appointed time, and there's the time of the end. Now, when you take a look at Daniel, you find that you have the vision is always followed by additional information, and the time element is always in the additional information. It's not in the original vision. And so keep that in mind. Daniel is he's consistent. He follows the same patterns over and over again. And in the vision here, the what is Daniel 11:2, the 12:4. The additional information is verses 5 and following, and that's where you would expect to get the time element for the vision, and that's exactly what happens. It was the same in 7, it's the same in 8. Here's what we get. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillments of these wonders be? He's asking the time question now in the additional information. He's about to get the time answer. That's the same thing that happened in 8. After the vision, he says, how long will the vision be? And he's given the 2,300 evenings and mornings. Again, he's consistent. So let's take a look first at for a time. This comes in verse 23. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people, but only for a time. So when the papacy is coming up in Daniel 11:23, right away it tells you there's going to be a time frame for it to operate in. Now, I made an assumption that that time frame would be the same as a little horn in Daniel 7, because I understood them to be the same, which would be time times and half a time, or 1,260 years. Well, let's take a look at what we get in 12:7. He's asked the time question. What's the time answer? It says that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. So when you want to know how long the time is, it is the same as a little horn. And this is he's asked the time question for the content of the vision of 11. We're now getting the time answers for that time period of chapter 11, for a time. So what do we have? The papacy would be strong from 538 to 1798, same as the little horn. In there is the Crusades. And it's going to be coming down towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. So that's the time period of the papacy. But the one I really needed was the appointed time. I remember checking in the commentaries and stuff, and mostly they don't say anything about it. So if the commentaries are skipping it, you know you're in a little bit deeper water now. And so this is where I really needed information. Because if I'm right, the appointed time should be happening right at the end of the Crusades as we go into the Ottoman Empire. If I'm wrong, it shows up somewhere else. So here's what it says about the appointed time in Daniel 11. At the appointed time he shall return and go towards the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. To me that says Ottoman Empire. The first conflict is the Crusades. The last one's the time of the end. The one in the between, the Ottomans. I mean, that's just the way the history goes. Matches the text. But what about this appointed time? Well, we should be looking at a start of the appointed time right about there. Now, the first mention of the appointed time is in Daniel 8:19. Now here's a little hint that can be useful for you. Anytime you want to understand what the Bible is saying or a writer in the Bible is saying about something, when you get the first mention of it, they'll often give you an explanation of it. You do the same in a conversation. When you bring up a new topic, you explain it, and afterwards, you don't explain it every time that part comes up, because you already did. So look for the first time it comes up. If you want to know what speaking in tongues is, look for the first time it shows up in Acts 2, and it'll give you an explanation. But in this case, what's the appointed time? And here's what it says. Look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time. Whoa. Oh, that was. For at the appointed time, the end. Now, the words shall be are in italics in a New King James or a King James Version. That doesn't make them more important, it makes them less important. It means they were supplied by the translator. And so in the Hebrew, it's just at the appointed time, the end. Well, the end of what? It's sure not the end of time right out in the middle of the prophecy. There's still more conflicts after it. There's one before it, there's one after it. What is it? Well, it's the latter part of the indignation, but nobody seemed to want to explain what that was either. So I'm thinking about this, at the appointed time, the end. The end? Well, if you're looking at the 1260 years, you're looking for an event at the end of it. If you're looking at the 2300 days, you're looking at an event that would be at the end of it. The prophecy is to get you ready for an event at the end. So we should be looking at the end of something at the appointed time, but it should also be the latter part of something. But I didn't know what that would be. But if in Daniel 12 it gives you the time element for the appointed time, for a time, the 1260, well, then we might just have what the appointed time is. And sure enough, we do. But when you're looking at Daniel 11, it actually mentions the appointed time 3 times. And here's what's interesting. In Daniel 11:27, the end will still be at the appointed time. The appointed time is yet future. Verse 29, you're now at the appointed time. It's present. Verse 35, it is still for the appointed time. How do you go future, present, future in a sequential chapter? However, there is an answer. If you're going to have 2 ending points, how many beginning points are you going to need? 2. The time prophecy in chapter 12 that would give us the appointed time. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. Well, there are 2 abominations of desolation. And Jesus even talks about them. In Daniel 9:27, we have an abomination of desolation. And in Matthew 24, Jesus applies it literally to the city of Jerusalem. In Daniel 11:31, Jesus takes the second abomination of desolation and applies it globally to the people of faith, the place and the people. And so, let's take a look at these 2 abominations of desolation. Daniel 9:27. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Now, some theologians say, well, that's the abomination that desolates. That is not the abomination of desolation. True, that's what the Hebrew says. But Jesus picks it up in Matthew 24 and said, this is the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, which is the destruction of Jerusalem. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So Jesus sees this as the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke about. And since Jesus can say it's the abomination of desolation, I figure I can too. Since I'm a follower of Jesus. And it was literally fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Now, Jesus goes on, for then there will be great tribulation such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And from that second abomination of desolation that starts the persecution, you're going to get the future one. You get two different ones, one for the place, one for the people. Now let's take a look. If you go from 70 A.D., 1290 years, it brings you down to 1360. And when I did the math, I was happy. Because it's right after the Crusades. And I did a quick search on my computer. What is happening in 1360? Now, I'm thinking about two things. The Ottoman Empire and the Reformation. Why the Reformation? Because between verse 29 and 39, it talks at least as much about the Reformation as it does the Ottomans. So you got to keep both of them in mind when you do your search for what's happening. And when I do that search, I find out in 1360, John Wycliffe is beginning his ministry. Does that have anything to do with the beginning of the Reformation? A lot. He's called the morning star or theologian of the Reformation. Okay? I run 1335, it brings me to 1405. And hey, this is, I'm curious what's going to be happening there. And I find that a guy by the name of John Huss, June of 1405, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, sends out a decree to the Bishop of Prague to shut down a guy by the name of John Huss, who is teaching from the writings of a guy by the name of John Wycliffe. And in June of 1405, the decree comes forth, and the bishop says, okay, Huss, you got to recant what you're teaching. And for a little bit, he decides he should follow the church because he's sworn allegiance to the church. And then he thinks, no, I have a greater allegiance to Jesus and the Bible. And he becomes what historians call the first practicing reformer. Would the theoretician of the Reformation and the first practicing reformer have anything to do with the beginning of the Reformation? No, huge. I was excited. I'd found something nobody had ever found before. And then I found out that a guy by the name of William Hale was teaching this in the 1830s. He was part of the Millerite movement. But that got forgotten. I'd never heard about it. Never heard about it in any of the Daniel 12 symposiums I went to. But I found it in a book called Leroy Froome's book, Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers. It's light reading. For those of us that like history. It's a multi-volume set about prophecy and history. So that was exciting. Look what the book Great Controversy says, talking about these reformers. Chapter on John Wycliffe. Except among the Waldenses, the word of God had for ages been locked up in languages known only to the learned, but the time had come for the scriptures to be translated and given to people of different lands in their native tongue. Now, E.G. White, the author of this, lived through the Millerite movement and probably would have known William Hale. All right? And so it's interesting, when you come to Wycliffe, in the Great Controversy, it says, the time had come. Wycliffe, there's some kind of a time. And the only time prophecy I can find is the 1290 from 70 A.D. The world had passed its midnight, the hours of darkness were wearing away, and in many lands appeared tokens of the coming dawn. Have you had the break of day yet? Nope, it's the pre-sunrise. It's the increasing light right before the break of day. When does the break of day happen? The chapter on John Huss. So perish God's faithful light bearers. He's condemned in 1405, and by 1415, he's been burned at the stake. So perish God's faithful light bearers, but the light of the truths which they proclaimed could not be extinguished, as well might men attempt to turn back the sun in its course as to prevent the dawning of that day which was even then breaking upon the world. Wycliffe is the morning star indicating the coming dawn. When does the sunrise hit? With Huss. It matches what I found in Daniel 11 and 12. That was exciting to me. So what do we have here? We have an introduction to the Reformation between 1360 and 1405. That 45-year difference between the 1290 and 1335 is an introduction to the Reformation, but it's also an introductory period to the Ottoman Empire. During this time period, the Ottomans are climbing in the power. And by 1453, the Ottomans have gotten so strong they've taken Constantinople, Istanbul, for their capital. The Eastern Roman Empire is captured by them. And so during this introduction time period, you have the rise of both Islam and the Reformation. And Daniel 11:29 are about the Ottoman Empire and the Reformation. So that part works. But there's a second abomination of desolation that got us into this one, which is in Daniel 11:31. So let's go to that second abomination of desolation now. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile his sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation until the time of the end. This time, the second abomination of desolation, whatever you look at, however you look at it, it's going to end up taking you down to the time of the end. All right, so the papacy gets the force of arms from Clovis, who's in power, and that's right there around 508. 1290 years later brings you to 1798, when the papacy loses its power, church and state power. So they're able to persecute God's people during this time. If you want to know 1335, it brings you down to 1843, and that biblical year is going to extend over into 1844, like around March or April, the biblical years. Depends on multiple factors that are really kind of hard to figure out, because you have to know the barley crop and the weather in the Jerusalem area to actually know for sure on Hebrew calendar stuff. And that's each year you have to know that stuff. This is why there's a lot of confusion about some dates, because some years you would have a 13th month on the Hebrew calendar. How would you know when to add a 13th month? Based on the barley crop. And what happens if you have an early or a late barley crop? Some people say, I can just look at the stages of the moon and everything, astronomy, and I can figure it out. And I said, okay, do you know the weather enough to know what the barley crop was that year? No. Do you know the weather on the day that they were sighting the new moon? Because if they can't see it, they wait a day or so to get it. They've got to sight it. And because we don't know the barley crop and the weather, it's really, really difficult to pin down some things in the Jewish calendar. But I got into that simply because it would be sometime around March or April the New Year would begin. All right? For people who can tell you the exact date, they're going by astronomy and they're skipping a whole bunch of detail that's in the text. Now, these time periods, the second abomination of desolation, brings you down to 1798, 1843, which is going to take you to the time of the end. Now, you have the appointed time. You have an introduction to the Reformation over here. It's now strong. And during this time period, to 1843-44, both the Reformation and the Ottoman Empire are going down. Ottomans become the sick man of the East, and the Reformation accepts the counter-Reformation teachings on prophecy from the papacy, preterism and futurism, which is really taking the wind out of the sails of the Reformation. So it's just amazing how you have the rise, strength, and fall just on these appointed time things. It hits the history. Now, some people say, but you have an overlap here. Well, let me back up to something. How can you go back? Once you're down here in verse 29, how can you go back to 508? Well, there's something called a vav disjunctive. How many know what a vav disjunctive is? Okay, I figured not too many people would know that. In Hebrew, verb forms, you have conjunctive and disjunctive. A vav conjunctive means this happens and then this one and then this one. They're sequential. And most of the time in Daniel 11, you're going along with vav conjunctives. But when you come to Daniel 11:31, it is now a vav disjunctive. I've talked to Hebrew scholars and I said exactly how would you describe that? And one of the best description is it's a camera change. If you're watching a movie, you're watching something and all of a sudden they show you something from a different angle, or they go back and show you the same thing but from another person's perspective. And so when you have a vav disjunctive, there's a break in the story and you're getting a different angle to explain it. Now, I'm not a Hebrew expert. And I was presenting in the Daniel 11 conferences in Berrien Springs, and I was going to be presenting the next day, and I've been involved in discussions all day long, the day before in Daniel 11. And I was thinking about the questions that came up, and I was trying to figure out how to answer them in my presentation. And what they said they were looking for is they were looking for the pivot point when Daniel 11 goes from literal to symbolic. And they all wanted a pivot point. And I was laying in bed thinking about that, and all of a sudden some ideas came in, and then for a couple of hours I'm wrestling with ideas and Bible text in my mind. I finally get it sorted out. And I said, Lord, can I not go to sleep now? Would you just let me alone and so I can go to sleep? I need to sleep some before I do a presentation. I'm about out, and all of a sudden a brand new piece of the idea hits. Boom. Oh no. I wrestled through that, finally get some sleep. I walk in to the Berrien Springs Village Church in the morning where the conference was being held, and the guy in charge of the day is Conrad Vine. I walk up to Conrad and I say, Conrad, I know I submitted a paper months ago on my presentation, but God kept me up most of the night, and I've got major changes. Can I make the changes? Or do I have to present on the paper? He said, if God kept you up, you make the presentation based on what he kept you up over. I said, okay, thank you. About this time, Roy Gain is walking into the church, one of the best Hebrew experts that we've got. And I walked over to Roy and I said, Roy, Daniel 11:31, is it vav disjunctive or vav conjunctive? I don't know a lot about Hebrew, but I knew enough to ask the question. Now, this is rather disgusting. He doesn't even need to look. He goes, well, it's a disjunctive. Why? He's that kind of Hebrew expert, okay? I said, thank you. I'm going to make my presentation. Because if Roy would have said it's conjunctive, I would have decided it was me keeping me up all night and not the Lord. But now I'm thinking it's the Lord that did it. Because now it even matches the Hebrew, and I didn't know what the Hebrew was. Does Daniel ever do repeats? Get to a point and then go back in time to give it to you from another angle? Some of our theologians say, no, he doesn't. Some say, yeah, he does. Well, let's just take a look at Daniel 11. The last few verses, 44 and 45, we have tidings from the east, tidings from the north, the loud cry. The king of the north goes out to attack God's people, and most of our theologians agree on this part, and the papacy comes to its end. Okay. Does it tell you how the papacy comes to its end? No. So you have a break in the story. Daniel 12:1 picks it back up. And it goes back and says, at that time. At what time? At the time the papacy attacks God's people, Michael's going to stand up. The judgment ends. At that time, there's a time of trouble like there never was. At that time, Jesus delivers his people, and he stops using the phrase as that time as he moves forward. And so during this time period, the phrase at that time lets you know that you've got an overlap. He now tells you how he takes down the king of the north. Well, in Daniel 11 and 12 with the 12:19, 13:35, the first one starts from a literal fall of the temple, and you have everything up through Daniel 11:30 is what's happening around the Mediterranean. It's very literal place-centered. But then he steps back in time and gives you when the papacy gets the force of arms, and he now describes how the papacy is attacking God's people of faith over their time of power when they have papal supremacy. You have the place and the people. And this one brings you to the time of the end, like it said. Oh, I wasn't aware we were going to have that much good information when I was doing that. So, well, let's go back to that. So you have the appointed time, just a summary. Between these lines, you have the rise of the Reformation, its strength and decline. You have the rise of the Ottomans, its strength and decline. And God has given the bookends on both ends of it to show you when the appointed time is. Before the appointed time, you have the former conflict, the Crusades. After the appointed time, you have the time of the end conflict. By giving you the bookends of the appointed time, he gave you the placement of all three. The appointed time gives you when the times are for all of them. Now, what about the time of the end? There is nothing in Daniel 11 or 12 that will give you a time prophecy for the time of the end. It doesn't need to, because Daniel already did in chapter 8. And remember, 8 is part of 10, 11, 12 is the expanded explanation of 8. So this is all already given in the same unit, really. It's in Daniel chapter 8. How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 days, evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. But don't stop reading there. And then a voice says, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision of the 2,300 evenings and mornings. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision of the 2,300 days refers to the time of the end. The 2,300 days refers to the time of the end. The prophecy that tells you when the time of the end is the 2,300 days. Well, you take the 2,300 days and it ends in 1844. Well, the appointed time was to bring you to the time of the end. That works. It ties together. What are the reasons that 1844 is the time of the end? First, that's what it says in Daniel 8. The vision refers to the time of the end. Second, in Daniel 12, 4 and 9, it is sealed till the time of the end. And 8:26, the 2,300-day vision is sealed. When are they understood? Are they understood in 1800? No. Are they understood in 1840? They're beginning to be. But the Millerite movement, who's really digging into this, has a major misunderstanding. They assume that when Jesus is coming in clouds, it's coming to the earth, even though Daniel says he's going to the Ancient of Days, not the earth at this point in time. So they missed a detail in the verse. This is why it's really important not to fudge the details. You can really mess yourself up like they did. When did they understand it? It wasn't till the fall of 1844, when you are now in the time of the end. Third one, in Daniel 11, 35, and 12, 9, and 10, there's a link with being purified or being made white with the time of the end. But when you see tote on my charts, that's time of the end. In Daniel 8, the cleansing of the sanctuary happens at the 2,300-day mark. So when is our record made white or purified? Jesus already died for us, but he now is completing the work in the heavenly sanctuary. the legalities of it, so to speak. And that's when our record is made white. So that's the time of the end. Also, the seventh trumpet, third woe of Revelation, is while the dead are being judged. So if the third conflict is while the dead are being judged, then it's 1844 and following. Number 5. This is simple logic. I have discovered that if simple logic doesn't work, you probably have a problem. And you can get all kinds of elaborate explanations, and then you ask the simple logic question, and the whole thing falls apart. But here's the simple logic. Could Jesus come before 1844 and Daniel 8 prophecy still be accurate? No. If there's a prediction of a time period for the judgment, and Acts 17 says there's an appointed day for the judgment. If there's an appointed time for the judgment, Jesus can't come before it. But is there anything that says how long the judgment will take? No. How quickly could God judge the world? I would assume he could judge it at least as fast as it took to create it. You know, I think he could get the judgment done in a few milliseconds if he wanted to. But Jesus can now come at any time after 1844. And if you are living in the time when Jesus can now come at any time, you're living in the time of the end. And so we should be living ready to meet Jesus. This is why I tell people you need to be ready to be out of here in a year or less. I think it could happen that fast. You also need to be ready to die of old age first. Because we're living in the time of the end when we're supposed to just be ready. All right? If you're not ready to be out of here this year, and if you're not ready to die of old age first, you're not ready. You need to be ready for both. Now, let's take a look at something. How this is all interrelated, because we now have the time of the end beginning in 1844. So we have the 1260 years, but it's also linked to the end of the 1290. And historically, it's the strength of the Reformation of the Ottoman Empire. We have this one here with the appointed time. I guess what I'm trying to point out, the appointed time ends up linking every one of Daniel's time prophecies in one way or another into a solid whole. You know, it's like when you put the last piece in the puzzle and the whole thing locks together. This understanding of the appointed time actually connects everything into a whole where it's connected. And remember, it said that the appointed time would be the latter part of the indignation. Until I actually had the chart figured out, I didn't understand what that was. But then I'm looking at my chart, and now I can see things that are there. The appointed time would be the latter part of the indignation. If you go by the strength of the Ottoman Empire and the Reformation, it's the latter part of the 1260 years when God's people are being persecuted. Would that be an indignation? Yeah. But if you go by the outside ends of it, it's the latter part of the 2300 days when God's sanctuary is trodden underfoot, which is also an indignation. So it appears to be the latter part of both the 1260 and 2300 days, which are both an indignation. That was interesting. So there's something else on there that I should point out to you, and I'm forgetting what it is. Oh, yes. Over here, From 1798 to 1843-44, you have the introduction to the time of the end. This was the introduction to the Reformation and the Ottomans. But what do we have happening in here? Between 1798 and 1844, the allies of the King of the North and the King of the South are put in place. Revelation 11, you have the French Revolution, and as soon as you hit the end of this, as you're going into the time of the end, the third woe, the ideas of the French Revolution explode into Marxist socialism. Revelation 13, after the deadly wound, the second beast of Revelation is going to come up. And between 1798 and the 1840s, the United States is growing in power. It's now on the scene. Any time after this, you could have the time of the end conflict. You could have had Christ come ere this multiple times. It's amazing that in the 1840s, there were some attempts to establish a caliphate. In the 1860s to the 1880s, there were attempts to establish a caliphate. But they both faded away. It was as if God was saying, I've got everything in place. Are you ready? I brought a book to read with me on the gospel on this trip. And when I opened it up to read it, I've decided I must have had it a while, because inside was a newspaper clipping from New York Times about how in the 1880s there was a major attempt to set up a caliphate. Now, that's just kind of interesting. It's just a little reminder that God keeps rising something up, time out, it goes down, rising up, time out, it goes down. But what I've noticed is each time it gets further in before he says time out. And it's usually a pretty long time between time out and letting it come back again. But when the time out happened in 2020, it wasn't a long time, and we're now in full blast acceleration. And we've never been this far before, with the U.S. this involved in trying to take out radical Islam and the radical left at the same time. So, and I'll get some questions in a bit, all right? So, this is the time period that both the U.S. and the French Revolution come into being, right in here. Everything is now in place. But it doesn't matter if it's in the Adventist church or out of the Adventist church, there are people that are trying to use the 1290 and 1335 to set a date for the coming of Christ. And they think it's literal time of about 3.5 or a little over 3.5 years from some event that they pick to the coming or coming close to the coming of Christ. I really want to encourage you not to do that. Why might that be? Because there are two abominations of desolation in Daniel. One is 70 AD, and the other is when the papacy gets the force of arms, as in before the Ottoman Empire. There are not 3 of them in Daniel's writings. There are many abominations, and there's talk of desolation in other parts of the Bible, but they are not Daniel's abomination of desolation. And when Jesus talks about Daniel's abomination of desolation, he talks about the fall of Jerusalem and the persecution of God's people during the Dark Ages. And so I would suggest if you come up with a third one, it's now your prophecies, not Daniel's and not Jesus's. It's your prophecy. And you are now responsible for all the good or bad that it might do. I'm not willing to go there. I had one guy send out an email. I was on his email list. And he said, Jesus only said we couldn't know the day or the hour. He didn't say we couldn't know season, or the year. I read that, and I wrote a response. It was an email blast, but I could respond to the guy. And I said, that's interesting. Told him there's only the 2 abominations of desolation. And yes, it is true that we don't know the time. And Jesus says, but the day and the hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So far, he sounds right. I said, but do you realize there are words of Jesus in the New Testament that are not in the Gospels? And if you go to Acts chapter 1, verse 7, it says, it is not for you to know the times or seasons which the Father has put into his own hand. Times can actually mean years. And he definitely says seasons. And this guy had said, Jesus didn't say we couldn't know the year or the season. I said, so I would recommend that you correct the email that you just sent out. His version of correcting it was to cut me off the email list, so I never saw another one. And you've got a guy in the Northwest, that's writing books on this all the time and trying to get people to follow him. When Jesus says you don't know the day or the hour or the times or the seasons, I actually believe he means what he says. Because once we get into the third conflict, Revelation 10, talking about it, said a little book would be opened, Daniel. It would be exciting, it would be wonderful, it would turn bitter, and you're going to have to go do it all over again. Daniel 8 for the Millerite movement turned bitter because of their misunderstanding. You're now going to have to go do it all over again. In Daniel, it starts all over again with Daniel 11, starts in Daniel's time. This time goes all the way to the coming of Christ and explains the time of the end. But Revelation 10, when it says this, says, and there's time no more. And in Daniel 11 and 12, the time prophecies end right where Daniel 8 ended it. Now you're living in sequence with no time prophecies. And God can call timeouts anytime he sees necessary to prepare his people. That's why there's no time prophecy here. And it's interesting to watch it carry out. Okay. Let's take a couple of questions if you have any. And how much time do I have here today, somebody? I should be done by what time? 10:45 probably? Quarter till, okay. I think we had a question over here a while ago.
It was more of a comment. You were talking about how God raises the caliphate and then it goes down and comes back up. Revelation also talks about labor pains. This is a perfect example of God.
It's actually Thessalonians as well. It talks about labor pains. That it's like labor pains. What would labor pains be like? You get contractions? Yeah. What are labor pains doing? Preparing a woman's body for the birth. What are God's labor pains doing? Preparing the body of Christ for the coming of Christ. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. Good observation. Never thought of it that way, but I think I'm going to remember that. Got another question. He's going to bring a mic to you now.
Well, just speaking of caliphate, can you briefly explain what is a caliphate and what it does?
Okay. A caliphate. You have a papacy. It's led by a pope who claims political and religious power worldwide, and someday plans to rule the world. In the Muslim world, it's not a papacy, it's a caliphate. And the caliphate is ruled by a caliph who claims political and religious power globally and expects to rule the world someday. One of them attacks Jerusalem from the south and the other from the north. They are the kings of the north and the south. And the Muslim caliphate, those who are dreaming and hoping and planning for the caliphate, all believe that the global capital of the caliphate will be the city of Al-Quds, which is Jerusalem. All right? Your radical Muslims, Islamic State, Iran, Islamic State, you've got Al-Shabaab, you have the Muslim Brotherhood, Boko Haram. These are all groups that are looking to set up the caliphate. I will tell you, the most challenging situation, exciting in my eyes, would be for all the radical Islamists to decide that they should work together to establish the caliphate. Right now, they each want to establish their version of it, so they're competing, and they are not nearly as dangerous to the world as they would be if they united. I've got a gut feeling, I don't know this is a gut feeling, that they probably will unite and be taken out together. But right now, it's kind of like they're going one at a time in their attacks. And they don't have the support of each other. The Islamic State went, they got beat back, they're growing underground, but they've lost their territory by and large. Iran has been pushing next for the caliphate. They're getting beat back at the moment. And if Israel or the United States goes ahead and attacks them, they may be pretty well be pounded out of existence. What is the risk of the U.S. attacking Iran right now? Or Israel attacking Iran right now? Close to 70 days ago, Donald Trump said he was giving them, the Iranians, 60 days to make an agreement to get rid of their nuclear technology. And at the end of 60 days, he was going to bomb them like they've never seen before. Well, we're almost 10 days into the bombing period now. And yesterday, the peace talks, or the nuclear deal talks, broke off again. Also, in the last day or two, American sources say that American intelligence sources say that Israel is preparing to attack Iran. Well, at this point, Trump would not likely tell them no. But if an American intelligence officer is feeding information, either one, they should be in jail. Two, they're trying to stop Israel from doing it. Or three, they're trying to scare Iran. And if they don't go to jail, it's probably two or three. We never know quite what the truth is. You can just get pieces of it. But we are sitting, and we could really, it could go quickly. Any other question? I have one other thing I can do if I don't have a question.
We have one right here. Just another observation. In your charts, when you're showing...
It's got to be as good as the last one.
Yeah. In your charts, when you're showing everything starts at 70 AD, when you put up the 2300, that you should adjust that so it shows 457 BC. Because people will get confused when they look at that.
Oh, that's true. That's true. It needs to have an arrow or something pointing back.
One of yours says that that one does.
Yeah. True. I mean, that's a technical one, and it's true, but the other one was more fun that you gave me. All right.
Another question?
Pastor Gaynor, we got two questions here and then back to Gaynor.
Where do you usually get your news from like Israel and stuff? Like, where do you, since you say you don't like trusting the news, which is understandable, but like...
But I have no choice.
But you have no choice, exactly. So what would you recommend, I guess, to you that would help keep an eye
I will
out?
tell you what I do. It's not foolproof. First thing I do is I just check the Drudge Report. And he used to be right-leaning. He's now a never-Trumper. So you never know quite where he's going to be coming from. Definitely has his own opinions. And especially it's pro-homosexual in the kind of articles that he's going to look for. Okay? Which is why he liked Pope Francis. But he has a conglomerate of just headlines from all over the world. And I can click on that, and there's going to be conservative, left and right-leaning sources that are there. I'm then going to, on my computer, I'm probably going to click on the Jerusalem Post. And I'm going to get some information from there. The Drudge Report's going to give me information from European sources. And then, I can't even remember the guy's name, but a former American intelligence officer that has his own outfit that gives almost every day a list of 20 news items that he thinks is important for understanding what's going on in the world. And sometimes he's pro-left, sometimes he's pro-right, and that. Where he really is, I don't know. And then I have a few people around the world that are looking at news sources. One guy, he's in and out of Saudi Arabia a lot, and he feeds me information. This is something you can't get very easily. People that know what I do, and they'll feed me information. And there's a rabbi. He has a synagogue in Florida. He pastors a Seventh-day Adventist church, and he's got a synagogue. Jeff Zarensky. And he feeds me information from his sources around Israel. And so it's just you ask how I get it, that's it, and I'm just constantly, when I read an article, I look for different fingers, and I go all over the place based on those fingers. That's how I do it. Now, I don't typically watch the news. I don't have a TV at home to watch it anyway. It's faster for me to just do it on the internet and just and I'm not totally being filtered through a MSNBC, CNN, or Fox News agenda. That's how I do it. Okay, Pastor George Gaynor.
Tim, thank you for this morning. I'm just looking at this chart, and I'm not remembering, is this chart as it is there, as it is on the screen, is that in your book?
No, but there is about a 4-page description of it in the appendix.
In the newest
Yes.
The newest one.
Yes. It actually was not in the first Review and Herald version of the book. They did a second printing, and they said I was allowed to change things, but I couldn't change anything with pagination, which simply means if I wanted to add something, I had to take something off that page because any edit had the end at this, couldn't break pages. Every edit had to be within the page of the edit. There were 3 blank pages at the end of the book, and they said I could fill those. And so I wrote a description of the appointed time, because I'd now figured it out, and I included that. And so this is going to be the last 3 pages of the book in the appendix, right? The last sentence read, "So we are now living in the time of the end." A good way to end a book, right? They messed it up. They had a typo. The word not, they changed the the word now, they changed the W to a T. And so instead of reading, "So we are now in the time of the end," "So we are not in the time of the end." 1 letter.
Wow.
That was not a pleasant surprise. I had never even seen it. I was doing a camp meeting in Redwood camp meeting. No, it was the one at Lake Tahoe. And I'm presenting, and a guy raises his hand. I said, "I shouldn't take a question mid-presentation." He says, "But in your book," he just speaks up, "but in your book you say we are not living in the time of the end." And I said, "My book does not say that." He said, "Yes, it does. It's right here." I said, "I don't believe it. Show me." And I just walked down into the center aisle. He opens up, and I realized there's no white pages. He's got the new version. I've never seen the new version. I looked there. It says not. I said, "Thank you." And I'm walking back to the front, and I turned around and looked at everybody and said, "That is why you shouldn't ask me a question. Now I have no idea where I was." I said, "All I know is that's not what I sent the review." I got a personal apology from the president of the publishing house. They quarantined all the books that had not gone out. They said only about 300 were out. And somebody got the job of putting a sticker over the last line. Thousands of times. What a boring job. And so if you get that, when you can run your hand down and you feel a little bump over that line. That's just a kind of fun part, but yeah.
So again, the year that you were at Berrien Springs and in that disjunctive piece kept you awake all night. What year was that?
That was probably 20 or 21. I already had an explanation out there, but I didn't have the grammatical proof for it. And what I now know, if you're looking for a pivot point, this is it. When the grammar says, break in the story, we're looking at it from another way. Everything before it was literal, real battles, and the king of the north, at the end of the first one, goes home and attacks God's covenant people. At the end of the second one, he goes home and attacks God's covenant people. But this now gives the globalized persecution of God's people by the papacy. And when you get to the third conflict in the time of the end, he destroys the king of the south globally. And he doesn't go home to attack God's people. He attacks globally. This is your pivot point from the place to the people. The grammar supports it. Just like the grammar in Daniel 11:12, at that time, at that time, at that time. Daniel always puts something in his writing to show you where it is. This is not just a figment of imagination. There's a hint in the grammar that it's there. And I'm not the best grammar person in the world, but the grammar people support it. Okay. I guess we're pretty close to quarter till. Do we have one other question? I don't really have time to go into the other piece, but that's okay. It wasn't necessary. All right.
Could you speak to the end of the Reformation piece? Talk about preterism? Yeah, the piece of at the end of Reformation with preterism and futurism.
Okay. During this time period in here, this is when the reformers are accepting the counter-Reformation teachings. Teachings of the Jesuits, Ribera and, yeah, there's another one in there too. Anyway, where they're going preterism, everything was fulfilled before the papacy was on the scene, or futurism, just a bad guy at the end of time. Which means they stop seeing the papacy as the little horn, man of sin, beast, king of the north. And they're now wide open to getting sucked back in at the time of the end. This is the preparation, introduction in so many ways to the time of the end. It's the decline of the Reformation and the preparation for the time of the end. This was the rise of the Reformation. This is the fall and then the beginning of the time of the end. It's amazing how both of those 45-year time periods are an introduction to the following section. I mean, how tight and consistent this is, to me, that was amazing to me. Well, let's have a word of prayer as we close. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your word, and I ask that you would continue to keep our minds working. Keep talking to us through your Spirit, and Lord, help us to listen to your Spirit as we read your word and as we listen to his voice. In Jesus' name I ask it and thank you.